On a bright April morning in 1985, a John Deere dealer named Phil Garrett drove his truck down County Road 12 in Custer County, Nebraska, and saw something that made him slow down and pull to the shoulder. A man was planting a field with draft horses. Not a tractor, not even an old tractor. Two massive Belgian draft horses hitched to a two-row planter, moving steadily down the rows while the man walked behind them in the particular unhurried way of someone who has done the same thing so many times that his body knows the pace without being told. Phil sat in his truck for a long moment. Then he pulled out his thermos, poured himself a cup of coffee, and watched. He was still watching when his coffee went cold. Then he started to laugh. He was still laughing when he pulled into the co-op in Broken Bow 20 minutes later. "You will not believe what I just saw," Phil said, dropping onto a stool at the counter. Walt Gruber planting corn with horses. Draft horses. Two of them. Like it's 1910. The men at the counter looked at each other. "That's Walt for you," said a farmer named Dennis Haas who ran 600 acres north of town. His daddy farmed with horses. His grandfather farmed with horses. "Walt figures if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for him." Phil shook his head. "It's 1985. We've got GPS guidance systems coming. We've got variable rate planting. We've got 8-row planters that do in one pass what it takes Walt 2 weeks to do, and he's out there walking behind horses." "You tried selling him a planter?" Dennis asked. "Tried selling him everything." Phil set down his coffee. "Tractor, planter, grain drill, combine. Walt comes in every year, looks at everything, asks questions that show he knows more about the equipment than I do, and then goes home to his horses. Never buys a thing." "He can't afford it," someone said from the back. Phil shook his head. "That's what I thought too, but Walt's got money. His place is paid off. He's been farming those 400 acres for 20 years without a dollar of debt. He could buy whatever he wanted." "Then why?" Phil looked out the window at the street. The gas station across from the co-op had its prices up on the sign. Diesel was $1.25. That was the new normal, had been since the second oil crisis. I asked him once. You know what he said? "What?" "He said horses eat grass." Phil paused. I thought he was joking. Nobody laughed. "Let me tell you about Walt Gruber, because you cannot understand what he was doing with those horses without understanding where he came from." Walt was born in 1938 in Custer County, Nebraska, the only child of Raymond and Helen Gruber. Raymond farmed 400 acres of dryland corn and wheat ground that his own father had homesteaded in 1901. The land was hard and dry and demanding in the particular way of Nebraska sandhills country, which is to say it produced for a man who paid attention and punished a man who didn't and had no interest in the difference between the two. Raymond Gruber had farmed with horses his entire life. Not because he couldn't afford a tractor. He had bought a Farmall H in 1948, driven it for one season, and parked it in the back of the machine shed. He had done the math, and the math had told him something that nobody else in Custer County was willing to believe in 1948. The Farmall H burned 12 gallons of gasoline a day in field work. At 20 cents a gallon in 1948, that was $2.40 per day. His team of 4 Belgian drafts ate hay that grew in his own fields, oats he raised himself, and water from his own well. The daily cost of running the team was the time it took Walt to feed and harness them each morning, and the cost of the blacksmith twice a year to shoe them. Raymond had laid these numbers out on paper at the kitchen table one evening in the fall of 1948 and shown them to Walt, who was 10 years old. "See this," Raymond said. "This is what the tractor costs to run every day." He pointed to the number. "This is what the horses cost." He pointed to the other number. "The horses are cheaper." Walt studied the numbers. "But the tractor is faster." Raymond nodded. "Faster costs more. And speed that costs more than it earns is not speed. It is debt with good advertising." Walt had been 10 years old. He had not fully understood the lesson, but he had remembered the numbers. And 20 years later, when he was running the farm himself, he had done the same calculation with the new numbers of 1965 and reached the same conclusion. He bought a tractor anyway. In 1966, he bought a used International 560 from a neighbor who was upgrading. He paid cash, drove it home, parked it in the machine shed, and used it exactly as Raymond had used the Farmall H for the jobs the horses could not do: pulling stumps, moving grain bins, the heavy lifting that required horsepower beyond what even 4 Belgians could produce. For everything else, he used the horses. His neighbors thought he was making a virtue of poverty. They assumed he used the horses because he could not afford to run the tractor full-time. This was not correct. Walt used the horses because his father had shown him the numbers at a kitchen table when he was 10 years old, and the numbers still said what they had always said. Horses eat what you grow. Tractors drink what strangers sell you. Let me tell you about the notebook, because that is where Walt's thinking lived. Raymond Gruber had kept a farm notebook every year since 1922. Not a diary, not a journal, a ledger. Every expense written down, every income recorded, every cost per acre calculated at the end of each season: fuel costs, equipment costs, seed costs, fertilizer costs, labor costs, all of it in Raymond's careful handwriting, in the same kind of black composition book he bought at the general store in Broken Bow for 15 cents. When Raymond died in 1971 and Walt took full ownership of the farm, he found 29 notebooks in the top drawer of the desk in the farmhouse office. He read all 29 of them over the course of a winter. He made notes in the margins with a red pen, comparing numbers from different decades, tracking how costs had moved relative to income over 30 years of farming. What he found in those numbers confirmed something he had already suspected but had not been able to prove with data. In every year when fuel prices rose sharply, the farms in the township that were using horses or mules came through better than the farms using tractors. Not dramatically better, not obviously better in a single year, but over time, over a decade, the farms with animal power had survived price shocks that had damaged or destroyed operations built entirely around internal combustion. Raymond had understood this intuitively. The notebooks proved it mathematically. Walt started his own notebook in 1971. He recorded everything Raymond had recorded, and one thing more. Every year he wrote down what it would have cost him to run the farm with a full tractor operation instead of horses. The fuel, the equipment payments, the maintenance, the depreciation. He called this column the cost of speed. Every year the cost of speed was higher than what he actually spent. By 1985, he had 14 notebooks. The numbers in the cost of speed column had grown every year since 1973 when the first oil shock had hit. They had grown again in 1979 when the second oil shock hit. They had grown every year in between as diesel prices settled at a new higher normal after each crisis and never came back down to where they had been before. Walt's actual costs had grown too. Hay prices had risen, oats had risen, the blacksmith charged more, but his costs had grown at a fraction of the rate that the cost of speed had grown. By 1985, according to Walt's calculations, running his 400 acres with horses instead of tractors was saving him between $8,000 and $12,000 a year compared to what his neighbors were spending on fuel alone. Nobody knew about the notebooks. Nobody knew about the cost of speed column. Nobody knew about the calculation Walt had been running in his own farm books since 1971, while his neighbors were laughing at his horses at the co-op counter in Broken Bow. They saw a man planting corn in 1985 with horses. They saw someone who had not kept up, who had not modernized, who was working harder and slower than everyone around him and producing less per hour of labor. They did not see the savings account. Let me tell you about the savings account, because this is where the story turns. Walt had 3 sources of income. The first was the 400 acres he farmed himself, corn and wheat in rotation, producing between $15,000 and $22,000 net per year depending on prices and weather. The second was custom work. Walt's Belgians were known in Custer County for their ability to work ground that tractors could not reach: steep waterway edges, tight corners near tree lines, wet ground in early spring before it could carry equipment. Farmers hired Walt and his horses for specific jobs when their tractors could not do them. This brought in another $3,000 to $5,000 a year. The third was something nobody in the county knew about. Walt had been buying land. Not his own land, not parcels adjoining his home place. He had been buying land in other townships, in other counties, quietly, through an attorney in North Platte who handled the transactions without advertising, whose name was on the deed. Small pieces, 20 acres here, 40 acres there, a quarter section that came up at an estate sale in Dawson County in 1978, a strip of creek bottom in Sherman County in 1982 that nobody wanted because it flooded most springs. He had been doing this since 1975, since the first oil shock had passed, and he had understood that it would not be the last, and that when the next one came, land would be cheap for those who had money and expensive for those who had debt. By 1985, Walt Gruber owned, in addition to his home, 400 acres, another 580 acres scattered across 3 counties. All of it was rented to tenant farmers at rates that averaged $45 an acre. All of it generated $26,000 a year in passive income that appeared in no public record connected to Walt Gruber's name. The man they laughed at for planting with horses was netting somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000 a year. He was spending about $9,000 of it. The rest went to certificates of deposit at banks in Broken Bow, North Platte, and Kearney, because Raymond had taught him never to put everything in one bank, and because Walt had read enough history to know that banks could fail and the money you kept in 3 places was safer than the money you kept in one. Now let me tell you about 1988, because that is when the first neighbor came to him. Dennis Haas had been farming north of town for 22 years. 600 acres, 2 John Deere tractors, a self-propelled combine, a grain dryer, the full modern operation. Dennis had expanded through the late 70s on the strength of rising land values and favorable operating loans from the Broken Bow branch of the Federal Land Bank. When the farm crisis hit in 1983, Dennis had survived. Barely. He had renegotiated loans, sold equipment, cut costs in every direction. But he had survived, and by 1986 he thought the worst was behind him. It was not. Diesel that had been $1.20 in 1986 was $1.60 in 1988. Dennis's fuel bill had grown by 30% in 2 years. His corn prices had not grown at all. His loan payments had not shrunk. He was making them, but only just. On a Thursday evening in October of 1988, Dennis Haas drove to Walt Gruber's farm for the first time in 20 years of being neighbors. Walt was in the barn finishing the evening feeding. The Belgians, a team he had bred and trained himself from a line going back to his father's horses, stood in their stalls in the particular massive calm of draft horses at rest. Dennis stood in the barn doorway for a moment before Walt noticed him. "Walt, I need to talk to you." Walt looked up. "Dennis, come in." Dennis walked into the barn. He looked at the horses, then at Walt, then at the floor. "I've been thinking about something you said once, about horses eating grass." Walt went back to the feeding. "What about it?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. "My fuel bill last year was $19,000. Walt said nothing. "The year before that it was $15,000. Dennis looked at the horses. "What does it cost you to run those for?" Walt thought about the notebook, about the column he had been keeping since 1971, about the number he had calculated every year for 17 years. "About $1,200, Walt said. "Hay, oats, shoeing, veterinary." Dennis stared at him. "$1,200. Give or take." The room was quiet except for the sound of horses eating. Dennis said, "I used to laugh at you, at the feed store, called you behind the times. I know. I was wrong." Walt looked at him. "You weren't wrong about the speed. Horses are slower. I plant later than you. I will harvest later. I cover fewer acres per day. But you're still here." Walt set down the feed bucket. "I'm still here." Dennis looked at the horses for a long time. Then he said, "I can't switch to horses. It's too late for that. I don't know how, and I don't have time to learn, and my operation is too big for horses anyway." "I know. I just wanted to tell you that I understand now what you were doing. Why were you doing it?" Walt nodded. "How bad is it?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. If diesel hits $2, I'm done. I can't make the numbers work at $2 diesel with the loan payments I'm carrying." Walt looked at him. "When did you last read your loan documents?" Dennis blinked. "What? Your loan documents? The ones from the Federal Land Bank. When did you last read them?" Dennis said, "When I signed them." Walt went to the farmhouse and came back with a yellow legal pad and a pen. "Sit down," he said. They sat on hay bales in the barn while the Belgians ate, and Walt asked Dennis questions about his loans. The terms, the rates, the clauses, the options. Dennis did not know the answers to most of the questions. He knew his payment amount and his interest rate, and nothing else. Walt said, "Bring the documents tomorrow. We'll read them together." Dennis brought the documents the next morning. They sat at Walt's kitchen table with the notebooks stacked to one side and the loan papers spread out in front of them. Walt read everything. Dennis answered questions when he could and admitted he didn't know when he couldn't. On page 7 of Dennis's primary operating loan, Walt found a provision that Dennis had not known existed, a provision that allowed for restructuring based on documented hardship without triggering acceleration if the borrower initiated the process before default. "Dennis," Walt said, "you need to call the bank this week, before you miss a payment, while you're still current. There's a restructuring option in your contract that you didn't know you had." Dennis read the clause. Then he read it again. "Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Walt looked at the document. "Because nobody told you to read page 7. Dennis got the restructuring. It bought him 2 more years to work through the math of a high-fuel operation. It was not enough in the end. Dennis sold half his operation in 1991, 300 acres to cover the remaining debt. But he kept 300 acres. He kept farming. He did not lose everything." He said later that the evening in Walt's barn had saved him half a farm. Not the horses. The reading. Let me tell you about 2005, because that is when Phil Garrett came back. Phil had sold the John Deere dealership in 2001. The business had been struggling since the farm crisis years and he had never fully recovered his customer base. He was 61 years old and working part-time at the equipment auction barn in Broken Bow. Diesel in 2005 was $2.40 a gallon. Phil drove out to Walt's farm on a September morning. Walt was 67 years old and moving slower than he had in 1985, but still working. His son-in-law Carl helped with the heavy lifting now. The Belgians were a new team. The third generation descended from the horses Phil had seen on County Road 12 20 years earlier. "Walt." Phil stood in the yard. "Phil." Walt looked at him. "Been a while. 20 years, give or take." Phil looked at the horses in the pasture. "You're still running them." "Still running them." Phil was quiet for a moment. "Diesel's 240. I know." Phil looked at Walt. "You knew it would get here, didn't you?" "Not exactly here, but somewhere like here." Walt considered that. "I knew it wouldn't stay cheap. Nothing stays cheap. My father showed me that with numbers on a piece of paper in 1948. Fuel goes one direction over time. The question is how much of your operation depends on it." Phil said, "I spent 20 years calling you behind the times, writing you off, not even bothering to drive out here because I figured you were a lost cause." Walt said nothing. Phil said, "How much land do you own now?" Walt looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "I heard things. At the auction barn. County records. Someone mentioned your name." Walt was quiet for a moment. 980 acres. Phil absorbed that. 980. Free and clear. Free and clear. Phil looked at the horses. "Started with 400. My father's 400. Walt nodded. "The rest came from keeping costs low and waiting for the right moment. The foreclosure sales. Some of them. Some estate sales. One bankruptcy auction in 1993. Phil shook his head slowly. "You bought their land. When the price was right and my savings were ready." Walt looked at Phil. "I didn't enjoy it. These were my neighbors. But land doesn't disappear. It passes from one hand to another. I would rather it pass to someone who will take care of it than to a bank or a developer. Phil stood in Walt's yard for a long time, looking at the horses, looking at the farmhouse, looking at the machine shed where he could see the International 560 that Walt had owned since 1966, still maintained, still running. "You know what I told everyone at the co-op in 1985, Phil said. "I heard. I said you were embarrassing yourself, planting corn with horses in 1985 like it was 1910. Walt waited. "I was wrong about the horses," Phil said. "But more than that, I was wrong about you. I looked at what you had and I decided I understood what you were. An old-fashioned man afraid of progress. I never once considered that you might be the most forward-thinking farmer in this county." Walt looked at him. "Progress is a fine thing, Phil, when you can control the cost of it. When you can't, it becomes someone else's progress paid for with your money." Phil extended his hand. Walt shook it. They didn't say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. "Let me tell you one final thing, because it is the thing that matters most. Walt Gruber died in 2014 at the age of 76. He was in the barn with the horses the morning he died, the same place his father had spent his mornings. The same place Walt had spent his mornings for 50 years. His son-in-law Carl found him an hour later, sitting against the stall boards with his hand on the shoulder of the lead mare, the way you rest a hand on something familiar and permanent. The estate took 4 months to settle. The attorney in North Platte untangled the titles across 4 counties. When it was finished, the total was 980 acres of Nebraska farmland, free and clear, plus savings accounts and certificates of deposit totaling $412,000, plus the equipment including the 1966 International 560 that still started on the first try. Carl farms the home, 400 acres now. He uses a modern tractor. Walt would not have objected. Carl also keeps 2 of the Belgian mares. He does not farm with them. He keeps them because they are the 4th generation of a line that goes back to Raymond Gruber's original team, and because some things are worth keeping even when they no longer serve a practical purpose. The notebooks are in the farmhouse office, 29 of Raymond's and 43 of Walt's. The last entry in Walt's final notebook is dated October of 2013, a year before he died. It reads, "Diesel $3.82. Cost of speed this year, $44,000 versus actual cost of $1,100. 43 years of notebooks, 43 years of the same lesson. The man who controls his fuel controls his fate. The man who has no debt can wait. Patience is not a strategy, it is the only strategy. The Belgian mares are in the pasture where they have always been. The notebooks are on the shelf. The land is still in the family. And somewhere in Custer County, at a co-op counter or a diner booth or an equipment auction, there is probably a man being laughed at for something his neighbors do not understand. Walt Gruber would recognize him immediately. He would not say anything. He would just nod and go back to his own work and let the numbers tell the story when the time came. The numbers always tell the story. You just have to be patient enough to let them finish. Let me tell you about the winter of 2005, because that is when the phone started ringing. Walt had never been a man people called. He had been a man people talked about at counters and in diners and at auction barns, but not a man they called directly. That winter the calls started coming, and they did not stop for 3 years. The first call was from a farmer named Eugene Pratt, who ran 320 acres in the southern part of the county. Eugene was 53 years old and had been farming the same ground since he was 25. He had 2 John Deere tractors and a combine and an operating loan that had been manageable at $1.40 diesel and was becoming something else at $2.40. "Walt," Eugene said when Walt answered, "I need some advice." Walt said, "What kind?" Eugene said, "The kind that keeps me from losing this place." They talked for an hour. Walt asked questions the same way he had asked Dennis Haas questions in the barn 17 years earlier. The loan terms, the payment structure, the clauses, the options. Eugene knew some of the answers and not others. Walt told him to bring the documents. Eugene came on a Saturday morning, They sat at the kitchen table with the loan papers spread out between them and Walt's red pen moving slowly through the pages. Walt found three things Eugene had not known about: a hardship restructuring provision, a payment deferral clause triggered by commodity price decline, and a crop insurance requirement that Eugene had not been meeting properly, which had voided a portion of his coverage without his knowledge. The insurance issue was the critical one. Eugene had been paying premiums on a policy that was not fully in effect because he had not submitted a required annual field verification form. The form was referenced in the policy on page 11. Eugene had never read page 11. If Eugene had a significant crop loss in the current year, he would discover the gap in his coverage at the worst possible moment. Walt said, "Call your insurance agent this week. Before anything happens, get the verification form submitted and get confirmation in writing that your coverage is current." Eugene called. The agent found the gap. The form was submitted. The coverage was restored. 3 months later, a late spring hailstorm took 40% of Eugene's wheat. The insurance paid. Because Eugene had called. Because Walt had read page 11. Eugene told the story at the feed store. The feed store told the co-op. The co-op told the elevator. By the following spring, Walt's phone was ringing with a frequency that a man who had spent 40 years in deliberate silence found genuinely uncomfortable. He answered every call. He sat at the kitchen table with the notebook stacked to one side, and he asked the same questions every time. What are the loan terms? What does the insurance policy say? Have you read all of it? Bring the documents. He was not a lawyer. He told everyone who called that he was not a lawyer and that if the situation was serious, they needed a lawyer in North Platte or Kearney who understood agricultural contracts. But he could read. He could find things on page 7 and page 11 and page 14 that people had signed without reading and did not know were there. And sometimes finding those things made the difference. Carl asked him about it one evening. Carl had been watching this for months. The phone calls, the kitchen table sessions, the farmers driving out from 2 counties away with manila folders full of documents. "Why do you do it?" Carl said. "You don't owe these people anything. Most of them laughed at you for 20 years. Walt looked at the notebooks on the desk. "My father showed me numbers on a piece of paper when I was 10 years old. He didn't have to do that. I was 10. He could have said, 'This is farming, trust me,' and sign the papers and be done with it. But he showed me the numbers and explained what they meant and let me understand for myself." Carl waited. Walt said, "If one person had shown those numbers to Dennis Haas in 1978, Dennis would still have 600 acres today. If one person had read Eugene Pratt's insurance policy in 1995 when he first signed it, Eugene would have known about the verification form 10 years before the hailstorm." He paused. The information was always there. It was in the documents. Nobody read the documents. I read the documents. So I tell people what I found. Carl said, "You're saving farms that spent 20 years mocking yours." Walt said, "The farms didn't mock me. The men who own the farms mocked me. And most of them have figured out by now that they were wrong. The farms didn't do anything except sit there waiting for whoever was going to take care of them next." He went back to the notebook he had been writing in when Carl came in. Carl stood there for a moment. Then he said, "What are you writing?" Walt said, "This year's numbers. Diesel is $2.80 now. The cost of speed column is the biggest number I've ever written in it." He wrote the number. Then he wrote the date. Then he closed the notebook and put it on the shelf with the others. 43 years of notebooks. 43 entries in the cost of speed column. 43 years of the same lesson written in different numbers but always the same result. The man who controls his inputs controls his fate. The man who reads the documents knows what he agreed to. The man who has no debt can wait for the right moment. These were not complicated ideas. Raymond Gruber had explained them to a 10-year-old boy in 1948 using a piece of paper and 2 numbers. The boy had remembered. The man had built his life around them. Now let me tell you about the last auction Walt attended, because it happened in 2010, and it was the last time he bid on land and the only time he ever explained publicly why he farmed the way he had farmed. The Conley place came up for sale in the spring of 2010. 400 acres in the eastern part of Custer County. good ground, well maintained, came to auction because the third generation of Conleys had decided that none of them wanted to farm it, and a developer from Omaha had expressed interest in dividing it into acreage lots. Walt drove to the auction on a Tuesday morning in May. He was 72 years old and moving with the deliberate care of a man who has learned to conserve effort the same way he learned to conserve fuel. He wore the same kind of clothes he had always worn. Clean work clothes, boots that had been resoled twice, a jacket that was older than some of the farmers in the crowd. Phil Garrett was there. Eugene Pratt was there. Dennis Haas was there, working the half operation he had kept after selling 300 acres in 1991. 20 or 30 other farmers from around the county were there, and the developer from Omaha, a man in a suit who had driven up that morning and stood slightly apart from the crowd with the particular ease of a man who believes he is going to get what he came for. The bidding on the 400 acres opened at $800 an acre. The developer went to $850 immediately. Walt raised his hand. $900. The developer went to $950. Walt went to $1,000. The developer, who had clearly done his homework on what the land was worth in acreage lot development, went to $1050. Walt went to $1,100. The crowd was quiet in the way crowds get quiet when something unexpected is happening. Most of them had known for years that Walt had money. The Halverson auction moment had taught the county that lesson 2 decades earlier. But seeing it again, watching the quiet man in the resold boots bid against a developer from Omaha with a quiet certainty that suggested he was prepared to go considerably higher, produced a particular silence. The developer went to $1,150. Walt went to $1,200. The developer looked at his phone. He made a quick calculation. He shook his head and stepped back. $1,200 an acre. 400 acres. $480,000. Walt went to the clerk's table. He arranged for the cashier's check from his bank in Broken Bow. He signed the purchase agreement. He put his copy in the inside pocket of his jacket. On his way to his truck, he passed the developer from Omaha, who was talking on his phone with the particular clipped efficiency of a man revising his plans. Walt stopped. The developer looked up. Walt said, "I'm sorry you drove all the way from Omaha." The developer looked at him. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, clearly successful at what he did. He looked at Walt the way people from cities look at farmers of a certain age, with a politeness that does not quite conceal the assumption that the farmer is a simpler creature operating in a simpler world. "Do you farm this land yourself?" the developer asked. "Some of it," Walt said. "I rent most of it." "Why buy it then, if you're just going to rent it?" Walt considered the question. "Because it will be here in 50 years, he said. "The lots you were going to build will be sold and resold and subdivided and argued over in probate courts. This ground will still be producing corn." He looked at the 400 acres, flat and dark with spring moisture, ready for planting. "My grandfather's people came from Germany. They lost their land once to a bank. My father came to Nebraska with nothing and built something. I've spent my life making sure what he built stays in one piece and grows." The developer nodded slowly, not fully understanding but recognizing something genuine in the answer. Walt said, "The ground doesn't care who owns it, it just keeps producing for whoever takes care of it. My job is to make sure the people who take care of it own it, not the bank and not the developer." He shook the developer's hand and walked to his truck. Eugene Pratt caught up with him in the parking lot. "Walt, that was something." Walt looked at him. 400 good acres. It would have been a shame to see it cut into lots. Eugene said, $1,200 an acre. You didn't even hesitate. Walt said, "I knew what I could spend." When you know what you can spend, you don't need to hesitate. You just need to know the number. Eugene said, "How long have you known that number?" Walt thought about the notebooks. About 43 years of writing the cost of speed column and watching the savings grow because the cost of speed was going into the bank instead of the fuel tank. "Since 1971, Walt said, "give or take." Eugene shook his hand, drove home. Walt drove home too. He parked his truck in the yard, walked to the barn, checked on the horses, came back to the farmhouse, and sat at his desk. He opened the current notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the date. He wrote the purchase price and the acreage. He wrote the total and the source of the funds, which CD accounts he would liquidate to cover the cashier's check, which would be replenished from rental income over the next 4 years. He wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. Land does not depreciate. Patience does not expire. The man who knows his number and waits for the right moment does not lose. He closed the notebook and went to make supper. The Belgians were in the pasture. The notebooks were on the shelf. The 400 acres were signed and paid for. It had been a good day.